First of all, let me wish you, if you are a father or if you've had a father, happy Father's Day. It's good to be here again with you this morning, as you recall. Last week we heard two parables that Jesus taught, reminding us that we are called to walk by faith, not by sight. And today's gospel takes us back to where Jesus was teaching, but this time we hear of a boat, a nap, a storm, and fear. It's a story I believe we all know in our own lives. On that day, when evening had come, he said to them, "Let us go across the other side." So it was his fault, if you will. It was his suggestion that they go to the other side. Now, we know that God knows everything. He had to know a storm was coming. And so there is a purpose. One of the crazy, wonderful, absolutely fascinating things about Jesus is he teaches not only with parables, not only with his life, not only with the life of others, but even the events that take place around him. So the story continues, and leaving the crowd behind, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was. Then it says, and other boats were with him. Then the storm worsens. It says, the gospel, a great windstorm arose, and the waves beat into the boat, so that the boat was already being swamped. I don't know if you've ever been in a boat that was swamped. I once floated the Buffalo River in Arkansas when I was in college. And the first little curve we came around, we lost all of our beer because we swamped. You know, swamping's not a good place to be, but wait, Jesus is still there. But it says he was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him up, and they said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" You see, isn't that typical? In the middle of a storm, whatever that storm may be, one of our first thoughts, if we're honest with ourselves, one of our first thoughts is, doesn't God care? Then the good news. He woke up and he rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." Then the wind ceased and there was dead calm. Now, the difficult question, especially for those of us who are Christians and face our own storms, he said to them, and this is a difficult question, why are you afraid? Have you still no faith? And now the part of the story where I often find myself, and they were filled with great awe and said to one another, "Who then is this that even the winds and the sea obey him?" Now, I don't know where you are this morning, but we all face storms in life, don't we? Some of these storms are literal. Others that might be considered events that threaten us physically, maybe emotionally, and especially spiritually. We find ourselves sometimes in a metaphorical boat. God seems to be asleep, or at least uncaring, and we feel sometimes like we're on our own. We end up in that place where none of us want to be. Now, perhaps you've noticed this, and the older I get, the more I realize this, that no one gets out of this life alive. We know that. Yet, we often live as if that's not true. You see, when life hands us a challenge or we face a storm, we wonder if God is aware or even cares that we are facing a storm. I suppose when I was younger, I thought a well-lived life was one that minimized suffering and loss. Now I know that such a charmed life doesn't exist. So it's not a lack of suffering that we can hope for. But as we shall see, God is present with us in our suffering. Now, we've all faced those times in life that one of the great saints of the church, a man by the name of St. John of the Cross, calls the dark night of the soul. Those times when our lives and hearts are most marked, not with a tangible sense of God's presence, but just the opposite. For John the Cross, dark night of the soul is a forlorn feeling of being abandoned by God. He wrote this, both the sense and the spirit, as though under an immense and dark load, undergo such agony and pain that the soul would consider death a relief. The soul suffers from the conviction that, quote, God has rejected it, and with abhorrence cast it into darkness. But what feels like abandonment is far from it. The painful sense of being rejected by God, listen to this, actually prepares the way, as John of the Cross said, for an inflow of God into the soul. Perhaps you remember the struggles that Mother Teresa of Calcutta faced through her life, lovingly recounted in a book written following her death. Mother Teresa's suffering, when she felt God was hiding from her, was intense. It was a storm that lasted much of her life, from first to last. Her private correspondence to her confessors attest to that. Just a few passages, representative of the whole, convey something of the loneliness into which her sense of God's absence drove her. She said this, the longing for God is terribly painful, and yet the darkness is becoming greater. What contradiction there is in my soul, she wrote. In another place, she wrote, the pain within is so great. Please ask Our Lady to be my mother in this darkness. The place of God in my soul is blank, she wrote. There is no God in me. In the darkness, Lord my God, who am I that you would forsake me? Another place, she wrote, the one you have thrown away is one unwanted, unloved. I call, I cling, I want. And there was no one to answer, no one to answer. Whom I can cling? No, no one, alone. The darkness is so dark and I am so alone. And lastly, before I used to get such help and consolation from spiritual direction, from the time the work is started, now nothing. Now, if you have not faced this darkness of the dark night of the soul, or the sense of the absence of God, I've got something that might not sound like good news, but ultimately is. If you have not faced it, just wait, you will. I mean, remember, even Jesus did, right? On the cross. We have his words, which point to his struggle. In the midst of his own suffering, he quotes Psalm 22 and exclaims, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? What is your dark night of the soul? Are you still living it? Is the only way through such sense of God's absence is to find comfort in knowing others like St. John of the Cross and Mother Teresa faced it as well? Or is there something else we can hold on to? I have wondered why Jesus was sleeping during the storm. I imagine that it was far from peaceful and tranquil. The waves battering the side of the boat. Perhaps the loud sound of the rain. Maybe there was lightning and thunder, such loud noise that would seem to have been impossible to sleep. And yet the story is clear. After perhaps a long day of teaching parables, Jesus did what I often do between two services on Sunday. I take a nap. On first glance, we're good with that. What makes things problematic, for me at least, is that Jesus seems to wake up on the wrong side of the bed or the boat. Is it sacrilegious to suggest that Jesus seems a bit grumpy when he gets awakened? I suppose it's okay, but don't get stuck there. I sometimes do. I cut to the end of the story when Jesus challenges the disciples for not having faith that all will be well, and skip over the amazing events that took place leading up to the challenge. Let's look again. Jesus emerges from his slumber, stares right into the storm, and rebukes it. And what happens? The storm's calmed. The gospel said there was a dead calm. You see, that's the intriguing part of the gospel for me. The storm doesn't disappear. That's not what we read. It was just, if you will, reframed. It calmed down. The impending sense of doom disappeared. Now, you may hope, as I think we all do, that if we have enough faith, the storms of life, the, quote, dark night of the soul, goes away. I think that's exactly where many of us wander off into a sense of God's absence. But again, notice that the storm hasn't disappeared, but it no longer threatens them. With Jesus standing in the midst of the storm, peace emerges. What do we do with this? I mean, we face storms, all of us. Is the gospel simply suggesting that we just swallow hard and find a way to endure it? Is it simply a reorientation of how we perceive storms? Or is there something more powerful? As I said, we all face storms. My wife and I did. We got word on a Monday morning in March of 2017 that our son, who was in the hospital in Northern California, and we were in Houston, wasn't doing well. The doctor told me on the phone that if at all possible, we needed to get to him as soon as possible. And so my wife and I, with the help of my staff, boarded a plane that would take us from Houston to Northern California. We feared the worst, and my church began to pray for a miracle. We needed Jesus to show up and take care of this awful, life-threatening storm. I knew the story of our gospel this morning, and if God could stare into the face of the storm, He could do that for us. He could heal our son. There is much to this story as it unfolded, but it didn't end the way we had hoped. It didn't end the way we had prayed. It didn't end the way that countless numbers of people, not only in my church in Houston, but throughout this country, prayed. You see, we were present in Eureka, California, with our son Joseph as he took his last breath. That event changed me forever. My struggles were intense. I didn't go back to the church I was serving in Houston for several weeks, and when I did, it was a challenge unlike any I had ever faced. Preaching was nearly impossible. I couldn't make it through a sermon without breaking down. I had no capacity for any further suffering, mine or others. And finally, by the summer, I was aware that I couldn't continue serving. I limped through until November, and then took a 3-month sabbatical. And by February 2018, I retired early. And now I stand before you as someone who understands what it means to have a dark night of the soul. But it's not what you might think. I never questioned the goodness or the presence of God in my ministry or in my life. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even disillusioned. I was simply overwhelmed. And God's peace, through God's presence, slowly, imperceptibly at first, began to calm the storm. God did not take it away. The storm was still there. In fact, this morning, I can tell you, I was hesitant to share this story because I didn't know if I could share it without breaking down. The storm didn't go away, but a peace which passes all understanding finally emerged when I quit looking with my eyes and found it through faith. There's much more to my story, but what I do want you to know this morning is that God revealed God's self to me in ways that surprised me. I have since described this as God breaking my theological groundings wide open. What emerged, and I have to tell you this morning, continues to emerge, is an experience and an understanding of a God who is much more loving, much more accepting and present than I had imagined. Oh, I wanted God to take away my pain and prevent the loss. But instead, God gave me a glimpse into God's own suffering. Even though the sea threatened to engulf me, Jesus was there. He carried me. And when my grief threatened to destroy me, it did not. God was there. Not telling me that it would be all okay, but rather sharing my grief and revealing God's own. You see, that's just like God. Sometimes our hope is the size of a mustard seed. But know this, and I know it at the core of my soul, it's enough. What I experienced through the pain of suffering and loss was an inflow of God into my soul. Just think of that, an inflow of God into my soul. What I came to understand was simple yet profound. God is with us. The world is broken, and suffering is profoundly real. God does not always resolve things the way we hope, but God is always present, upholding, loving, sustaining us, even in the midst of death. And I can say this, even in the midst of the death of your greatly loved Son. The storms may still threaten, but God's presence, indeed God's peace, isn't elusive. But as we learned last week, and Paul said it well, the peace isn't found by sight, only by faith. You see, my story's not that profound. We all have stories. That's one thing I know. Each one of you represents a lot of stories of suffering, of loss, of pain, of death. We all have that. We all face that brokenness. Even so, the good news that I share with you this morning, the good news that I discovered not on a plane from Houston to Eureka, not on a plane from Eureka to Lawrence, not at the funeral, not at the cemetery, but later, as that influx of God's presence entered my soul. Jesus is with us, but so often, not in the way we expect. You see, one of my favorite Roman Catholic authors is a priest by the name, a Franciscan by the name of Richard Rohr. And he reminds us this: Jesus doesn't fit. Even after 2,000 years, Rohr writes, it is hard to realize what a revolutionary symbol, revelation, and reality Jesus is. He basically turned theology upside down, Rohr continues. He said, in effect, who you think God is, God isn't. You can't know this by merely studying theology or religion, but only through painful encounters with the living God, where you feel your flesh being torn off and yet you do not die. No greater description of the loss of a child than that. My flesh was torn off and yet I did not die. Then Rohr continues, you experience another kind of life, another kind of freedom. Christians call it the life of the risen Jesus. This may explain why the people who have met Jesus are humble people, because they've been overwhelmed by a humble God, because they have been a God who is not overwhelming and triumphant with all the answers and all the perfection, but a God who is somehow in this with us. A God who is infinite, yet somehow finite, who is in charge, yet chooses to not be in control at all. You see, one day, all will be made right. One day, the storms will disappear and only peace will remain. But in the meantime, we must join our hands together. We must lift up those who suffer. We must love the unloved. We must find ways to remove barriers to separate us, and knowing somehow God is with all of us, always. Sometimes the pain, the suffering, and the loss feels like our own Goliath, and all we've got is a handful of stones. But God will not abandon us. And we put our trust in that, in Jesus' name. Amen.